Good evening, and welcome to another great event in our Brain and Mind series. My name is Elizabeth Ivory, and I'm chair of NLC. Northumberland County, where NLC is based, is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. This territory has been inhabited and cared for from the beginning by Indigenous peoples and is covered by the Williams Treaties. We are all treaty people. This evening, we are joined by Dr. Adrian Owen. Dr. Owen is a professor at the Brain and Mind Institute at Western University and the former Canada Excellence Research Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience and Imaging. Dr. Owen is also the author of a best-selling popular science book called Into the Gray Zone. A neuroscientist explores the border between life and death. If you'd like a copy, our local bookseller, Furby's in Port Hope, has some in stock. Dr. Owen's topic this evening is a fascinating one. He called it From Coma to COVID-19, New Approaches to Assessing Brain Function. So please help me welcome Dr. Adrian Owen. Dr. Owen, please turn on your camera.
Hello there, and thank you very much, Elizabeth, for that introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me. Now I'm just going to share my screen and we'll be off. Okay, so please interrupt if you can't see the slides at any point during this presentation. So yes, coma to COVID-19. This is going to be quite a challenge. I usually either talk about coma in the context of very severe brain injury and neuroimaging, or more recently, I've been giving talks about COVID-19 based on a study that we conducted recently of 500 participants who were recovering from the effects of COVID-19. What I'm going to try to do is to illustrate to you all tonight why those two strands of research are connected and how one actually came to allow the other to occur at all. Now, the first part of my talk, I'm going to be talking about coma and conditions like the vegetative state. And I'm going to refer a lot to the concept of consciousness. So before I do that, I'm going to define what I mean by consciousness. And actually, I mean pretty much what everybody means when they use that word in everyday language. And it's really one of two things. Either you're talking about wakefulness or you're talking about awareness. Imagine, it's an illustration. Imagine what happens when you have a general anesthetic. You close your eyes, that's you losing wakefulness, but you also stop being aware of where you are and who you are in the situation that you're in. Exactly the same would be true in a boxing match. If somebody was knocked out, they'd lose their wakefulness as well as their awareness. Now, the interesting thing about examining patients clinically is that these two things are dissociable. That means you can lose one and not the other. And they're also measured in different ways. So wakefulness, or the wakefulness component of consciousness, is very easy to measure. If somebody's eyes are open, then they're awake. But awareness is much harder to measure. Just because somebody's eyes are open, it doesn't mean that they're aware. And let me give you an example. Now, I can't see any of you, so I'm just going to have to hope that you carry out or you go along with this example for me. What I want you to do is, everybody listening or watching this, please, if you understand what I'm saying to you right now, then raise your left arm. Okay. Now, I just have to hope you all did that. When I give this talk live, obviously most people in the room raise their arm. If you still got your arm up, you can put it down now. Now, what I was trying to illustrate there is what clinically we call command following. And that is the only way we know that somebody is aware. If I say to you, please raise your arm, and you do it, then I know that you are consciously aware. In fact, I know quite a bit more than that. I know that you can understand spoken English. I know that you can understand an instruction to raise your arm. And I also know that you can turn that instruction into a physical action. Now, what if you weren't able to do the last of those things? What if you weren't able to perform any physical actions? For whatever reason, your body was completely paralyzed. How then would I be able to determine whether you were aware or not? And the answer is, I couldn't, at least not until very recently. Based on behavior alone, we can't determine that somebody's aware. And this is a really big problem when it comes to a couple of conditions. One is the vegetative state that I'm going to talk about now. And this is often referred to as a case of wakefulness without awareness. And as you can see from this video, patients who are in a vegetative state are in a very curious situation because they open their eyes and they appear to look around the room. They don't look at anything in particular. So if there was a clock on the wall, they wouldn't stare at the clock. They would just have these sort of roving eye movements, but they grunt, they move a little bit. They're not on life support system. Their heart beats normally. They swallow normally. They obviously have to be fed and hydrated because they don't get up and move anywhere. But they're curious, as I say, because they are animate. But they won't respond to any form of external stimulation. If you say, squeeze my hand or raise your left hand, they won't do it. Or if you say, blink your eyes now, they won't do it. As you can see from this example, they do blink their eyes, but not in response to command. And this is the reason why it's always been assumed that these patients are wakeful but unaware. That is, they don't know who they are, where they are, and the situation that they're in. And the research that my group and I have done over the last 20 years or so has been to directly challenge this notion. Now, my journey started back in 1997 with a patient whose name was Kate. I was working in Cambridge in the UK at the time, and Kate came into the intensive care unit, actually with symptoms that looked very similar to severe COVID-19. Obviously, this was a long time before the pandemic, and that wasn't what the virus actually was that attacked her brain, but it was a virus from a similar family. And it actually led to her lapsing into a coma and then into a vegetative state. She opened her eyes. As I've shown you from the previous patient, she would sort of look aimlessly around the room. And we thought, well, why don't we put Kate into a brain scanner? In those days, we used a technique known as PET, or positron emission tomography. And we thought, well, let's put Kate into the scanner and see what's going on in her brain. Let's see whether we can find any evidence of residual function. Of course, we expected to see nothing because up until that point, nobody had bothered to scan a so-called vegetative state patient because they just assumed they would see nothing. So we put together a little experiment, and I'll give you a demonstration now. If I show you this face, now what has happened in all of your brains, I hope you all recognize this person. And what will happen in your brain is that an area known as the fusiform gyrus, which is on the right-hand side, at the back and at the bottom, you can see that what you're looking at there at the bottom is an MRI, a structural MRI of a healthy person's brain. At the top, I've just given you a sort of an anatomical map, if you like, so you can see which bits of the brain go where. This person is facing towards the right of the screen. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the brain, at the bottom and at the back, an area known as the fusiform gyrus, or it's often referred to as the fusiform face area. This lights up, and it's an area that we know is involved in recognizing familiar faces. Now, here's what happened in Kate's brain when we did exactly the same thing. We took pictures of her family and her friends, and we showed those pictures to her while she was lying in the scanner. And exactly the same area of her brain lit up, suggesting that she could recognize familiar faces, or at least her brain could recognize familiar faces. Now, we really had no idea back then whether Kate actually had any experience of seeing those faces, or whether this was some kind of automatic brain response, something that just automatically fires when you see a familiar face. But what we did know is that at least the face recognition area in Kate's brain was still preserved and still responding exactly as it would if she was perfectly healthy. Yet she was making no responses, showing no signs of any inner life whatsoever. The question was Kate aware or not? And actually, it would take us almost another 10 years to solve that puzzle. And we did it by going back to the example that I began this talk by giving you. I asked you to raise your left hand, and that's, as I said, clinically what we call command following. And I'm sure you've all seen this in a medical drama on TV, where a doctor will take an unconscious patient and say, squeeze your hand if you can hear me. That's the doctor looking for signs of command following, because command following means conscious awareness. But we had a problem with patients like Kate. we knew that she couldn't command follow. We knew that she couldn't squeeze our hand. I mean, we tried that many times. She obviously couldn't squeeze her hand. So we thought, well, could we find some way of command following using the brain and the brain alone? And this is where we stumbled on the idea that we would get people to imagine they were playing a game of tennis in the scanner. Sounds strange. There's not a tennis area of the brain, but there is an area of the brain that is reliably activated whenever you imagine playing tennis, and it's called the premotor cortex. And you can see it lighting up here in somebody who's thinking about playing tennis. It's right at the top of the brain. Now, this is not a cartoon you're looking at. For those of you who are not familiar with MRI, this is a more modern MRI scan. This is a three-dimensional structural image that's recreated from somebody's MRI. If I turned it round, you might even be able to recognize the face. And as you can see, we can metaphorically cut off the top of the head and look inside the brain and see the responses actually occurring. Now, this area of the brain, the premotor cortex, it fires when you think about doing things like imagining playing tennis. And really, it's just when you think about moving your arms around. It's an area that feeds into the so-called motor cortex, and it's for initiating plans of action. So when you think about waving your arms as if you were going to play tennis, the premotor cortex sets up all those plans, and it tells the motor cortex to actually move your arms. But even if you just think about it and don't go ahead with the whole movement, we see this activity. And the great thing about asking somebody to do something like imagine playing tennis is that activity will carry on until they relax, or until you tell them to stop imagining playing tennis. Then activity goes away. And once we'd worked all this out, we realized that we had a means for looking for command following in somebody who was completely paralyzed. And it wasn't long before a patient came along. This was not Kate. This was a patient a little bit later who'd been involved in a traumatic brain injury. She'd had a traumatic brain injury. She'd been involved in a road traffic accident. And for several months, she had opened her eyes. She was off life support, but she was producing no responses at all. And she was diagnosed as being in a vegetative state. Yet when we asked her to imagine playing tennis, that area of her brain, now you're looking at a view from the side of the brain here. The top are what happens in healthy volunteers. You can see that area at the top and towards the front of the brain lights up. And in our vegetative patients, curiously, when we said imagine playing tennis, exactly the same thing happened. And it continued to happen until we said, okay, just relax, stop imagining playing tennis. And then it went away. And then we said, well, play tennis again. And again, this area of the brain lit up. And you can see from this graph, these are the periods where we said to her, relax, play tennis, relax, play tennis. And that red line is the brain activity in that area of the brain, in the premotor cortex. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, this is just brain activity. We can't decide that somebody's conscious based on simple changes in brain activity. Well, actually, we can, because this is as reliable as asking somebody to raise their hand. In fact, the analogy I'll often use when I'm describing this to students is, imagine if you asked somebody to raise their arm and then put it down, raise it, put it down, and they did that 10 times in a row. Would you have any doubt that they were conscious and aware? And of course, most people say they wouldn't. And that's exactly what she was able to achieve here. She was able to turn on her premotor cortex when we said so, and then turn it off again, and to do that 10 times in a row. Now, that was pretty extraordinary. And I know it's a little bit sort of abstract trying to describe this, and you may not be familiar with how fMRI works. Let me show you a short video. It's only 2 minutes long. It's from a BBC documentary that was made about this work back in 2012. Unfortunately, the documentary team, they followed me around for many months, and they were present the day that we were able to elicit this type of brain response in a patient called Scott, who you've already seen at the beginning of my talk. So I'll just play this so you get a flavor of what it actually feels like in the scanning room itself. Scott, right, this is your big chance. We really want you to try as hard as you can to imagine playing tennis for us. Okay, we're going to ask you to imagine playing tennis quite a few times while you're in the scanner. And if you can do that, then we'll be able to see your brain activating. So I want you to imagine you're standing on a tennis court and moving your arm around as much as you can. All right, so we're going to put you in the scanner now. Just do your best. Stay awake.
This is a big challenge for brain-injured patients. It requires hearing, recall, understanding, a functioning mind.
Okay, Scott, it's Adrian speaking, and we're ready to start the first scan. This is where I want you to imagine that you're playing tennis. We've got a little bit of activity there. Okay, yeah, we've got something. Okay, this is what we want here. Okay, so you've definitely got more activity than we had previously.
Something remarkable is happening. Confounding more than a decade of medical assessments, Scott is responding in the scanner.
Okay. Pretty good, actually.
Striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Scott's been in the scanner more than an hour and needs a rest, but the team feel his responses clearly suggest awareness.
Now you can see a little bit there about how it actually works, and the technology now has been developed to the point that we can do this in real time. The patient, as you saw there, is still in the scanner when we are able to find out that they're not what they appear to be at all. They're actually conscious. Now, how many patients does this apply to? Well, we've scanned a few dozen patients over the years, I would say, but worldwide now, using this technique, more than 1,500 patients have been scanned, 1,500 patients who clinically appear to be in a vegetative state. And it turns out that about 20% of them can do this. This is just an example from patients that I've seen. There are 10 patients here that I've seen over the years, all classically in a vegetative state, but actually all able to imagine playing tennis. So of the 1,500, about 1 in 5, about 20% can do these tasks. And these have been now, I mean, this technique is used by many labs outside of my lab now, and it's been, I think, 34 different labs in the world have tried this, and they're all finding these same patients. Now, that still might not seem like very many, but you have to know that there are hundreds of thousands of patients like this around the world, because we're very good at keeping people alive. We're very good at helping people get through that acute brain injury stage in the ICU. Some of them pass away, some of them recover, and some of them unfortunately end up in this gray zone, if you like, somewhere between life and death in the so-called vegetative state. And it adds up to many thousands of patients worldwide. So I think this is a very important problem. Now, the next step that we moved on to was to say, well, if we can do this, surely we can actually communicate with the patient. I mean, that would be the absolute proof that they were conscious, if we could actually talk to a patient and have them answer us. And actually, it was a relatively small scientific step, but I think it was a major practical result for us. And what we did is we had a patient. We found that he could imagine playing tennis. This was a gentleman who'd been apparently in a vegetative state for 5 years at the point that we scanned him. We simply said, well, if you want to say yes, imagine playing tennis. And if you want to say no, don't do anything. And the first couple of questions were really just to establish that the method worked. So we said things like, is your name David? Nothing happened. Then we said, is your name Scott? And there you can see that he produced this activity in the premotor cortex of his brain. That's him imagining playing tennis, because he knows that to say yes, he has to imagine playing tennis. We then went on to ask a number of questions that we didn't know the answer to. Obviously, we knew that his name was Scott and it wasn't David. We didn't really need to go through the brain imaging method to find that out, but we wanted to know that this channel of communication was open. And we asked him questions like, are you in any pain? And that's terribly important clinically, because if a patient reported they were in pain, we could administer painkillers or analgesics to make them more comfortable. We also asked many questions about what he was subjected to in his life. In Scott's case, Scott got put in front of the TV very often, and he got to watch a lot of hockey because that's what he used to enjoy doing before his accident. We really wanted to check that he still enjoyed doing that because, of course, maybe he's changed his preference. And actually, in this case, he responded yes. And we've gone on to communicate with many patients now. The patient that we communicated with most, we saw, I think we scanned him 15 times over about an 18-month period. And this was a patient who'd been in a vegetative state for 12 years at the time that we started scanning him. And we managed to verify that he knew who he was, where he was, the situation that he was in. He remembered his accident. He remembered everything that had, or at least within reason, he remembered everything that had happened since his accident. So, for example, his sister had had 2 daughters since he'd been in a vegetative state. Those daughters came to visit him. He could tell us that, and he could even tell us what their names were and things that had happened to them. So again, absolutely no question that that patient was, like the other patients we've communicated with, completely conscious, not sort of partly conscious, completely aware of who they are, where they are, and the situation they're in. And in many cases, those patients have witnessed years and years of conversations in their presence, surrounded by people who perhaps don't know that they're actually aware. Yeah, I've got time to show you. This is just to show you how easy this is. I mean, it may sound like science fiction. This is from another BBC documentary where the presenter, a well-known British presenter, challenged me to be able to communicate in the scanner. He said, "I don't think I'll be able to do this." And I said, "This is pretty straightforward. You don't need to be a neuroscientist. Let me show you how."
Exciting research at the University of Cambridge is using the MRI scanner to see how the mind works. In the scanner next door is a willing volunteer I've never met.
I want you to face this way.
Not look in the window.
Don't look in the window.
I can't see your subject. By asking some simple yes or no questions, I'm going to try to find out a bit about him or her.
If the person in the scanner is trying to convey a yes, you're going to see a bright red area of activity around his premotor cortex and the supplemental motor area, right at the top in the middle of the head. Yeah. If the person in the scanner is trying to convey a no, what you'll see is the same area of the brain will be lighted up, but it'll be a blue-green color.
Are you a man?
There you go. I'm pretty confident this person is conveying a yes at this stage.
Are you over 6 foot high? He's now got a green area, so this is signaling a no answer, which would mean that actually this man is not 6 foot high. He's shorter than 6 foot. You can't actually see the brain think yes or no. That would be too difficult even for an MRI machine. What our volunteer was asked to do was to imagine playing tennis when he wants to say yes. And when he does, the area of the brain which deals with movement, his motor cortex, shows increased activity. And that is easy for the MRI to see. And this is our last question. Do you have facial hair? Again, pretty obvious activation. I would say that this guy's either got a beard or a moustache. Hi, thank you so much.
Now the clip cut out pretty fast there at the end, but hopefully you could see this was a male with facial hair who wasn't over 6 foot tall. I didn't choose the questions. Those were the questions that the presenter wanted to do at the time. He really wanted to challenge me to ask any questions of somebody in the scanner. So that's a sort of little example of actually how it works in real time. Now let's return to Kate. Remember, Kate was the person that we first put in the scanner back in 1997 when we didn't know anything about this population of patients and in the situation that they were in. And one of the amazing, well, there are many amazing things about Kate, but one of the extra amazing things, if you like, is that Kate recovered. So some months in the months and years after we scanned her, Kate started to make a recovery. Now, as you'll see in a few moments, she still has many physical challenges, but in terms of her cognition, if you like, in terms of her thinking and in terms of her personality, she's right back to where she was before. And in fact, she emails the whole team still more than 20 years on. She'll email us. And here's something that she emailed a few years ago. She said, the day you scanned me was the day I became a person again. It was the day that people stopped treating me like an object and started treating me like a human being. The scan was like magic. It found me. And apart from the fact that this is beautifully poetic, I think it also tells us a lot about the human condition. This is why it's so important that we do continue to find these people, because our consciousness is what we are. It's what makes us human. And when we're not conscious, or when people think we're not conscious, they stop treating us like human beings. And I think Kate put it, extremely well. But I have a short video here from another documentary made a few years ago with Kate, with her explaining what it was like to be in the situation that she was in.
Kate Bainbridge, once considered vegetative, who now takes great joy from the simplest things, like standing up in her special wheelchair. She's learned to feed herself. She communicates with friends and admirers every day on the internet. She paints watercolors. She's even written a book about her life.
Now, Kate is still going strong, and she still continues to make progress. But you saw there that she talked about recovery, and I'm going to move now to addressing that issue, because I think it's a very difficult word. Often we talk about these patients recovering, because sometimes they do, but very rarely, as you saw there from the video with Kate, very rarely do they go back to recovering in the sense that returning to normal life. They always have these ongoing challenges, as would perhaps not be surprising given the extent of their brain injury. However, and I'm not going to go into details about this, but this is a paper that we published earlier this year showing that these patients that have these brain imaging responses that can do these things in the scanner are more likely to recover than those who don't. So this is simply a graph showing the level of MRI, and that's the technique we're using, the level of response versus their outcome, whether they whether they survive and go on to a reasonable level of recovery, or in fact whether they don't survive at all. And as you can see, there's a nice correlation there. So not only are these MRI scans important diagnostically for finding out patients who are conscious when we didn't think they were, they're also important prognostically, because they can also tell us who is likely to recover. And of course, that's enormously important, because it's very difficult if you don't know what the future holds for a patient like this. It's extremely difficult, and sometimes very difficult decisions about the withdrawal of nutrition and hydration are made based on this uncertain future. And the more that we can contribute to helping both families and doctors know what the future is likely to hold, I think the better the situation is for the patients themselves. But if we really want to talk about recovery, we need to follow these patients long after they leave the ICU, long after they go back to wherever they go to their care homes or to their residential homes. And to tell you about how we do that, I have to go back to 1988, which is when I was doing my PhD back in the UK. And the project I was working on was to develop some of the earliest computerized tests of cognitive function. And by that, I mean things like memory and attention and concentration and problem solving. That was what I was doing in my PhD. And I was doing it to try and develop a whole suite of new tests that we could use to assess cognition in patients that had conditions like Alzheimer's disease. And I've stayed with this project actually for 35 years now, continually developing these tests. Back in the day, we had these huge, old, antiquated, computers that could, had terrible graphics, and of course now all of this runs on an iPad or on a one of the touch-sensitive tablets that we've all seen and experienced. And but over those years, as I say, the tests have been developed, and I've continued to use them in the lab for various different reasons. And so much so that actually over 14 million tests have been completed. We put them on the internet so that anybody that's interested in testing their memory or their concentration or their problem-solving abilities can just freely go and do them. If you go to creos.com, you'll find the tests and you'll be able to try them yourself if you're interested in how your brain is working. So we have 14 million data sets. And it's very easy for us to collect very large numbers of participants in various studies that I'll show you about in a few moments. And as you can see, I've in my lab and other labs, more than 300 scientific papers have now been published using these tests. Now, there's a reason why I'm telling you all this, but I'll get to that in a moment. Here's one example of one of the tests, and you can see from the cursor moving around, a participant is trying them. It's called the odd one out for a reason, which is you just got to find the problem that's the stimulus on the screen that's different to all the others. Don't get too excited. This is a very easy problem. That one's the odd one out because it's a different color. Now it starts to get more difficult. And this is true of all of the tests, that they get more difficult quite quickly so that we can really work out what somebody's, in this case, what somebody's reasoning ability is. And all the tests take about 1.5 minutes to complete, and you get a nice readout at the end telling you how good your short-term memory is, or your problem solving, or your attention. And we've been following patients leaving the ICU, and because this is web-based, we can send them away sometimes with an iPad, and we can say we'd like you to do the tests every week or every month to see how you're progressing. And we've got some really, I think, interesting and perhaps surprising results. This is a complicated graph. You really just have to get the general gist of it, which is that dotted line is where, quotes, healthy normal performance should be. And each one of those circles is a patient who's left the ICU performing one of the tasks. The list of tasks and their names are along the bottom of this graph. And as you can see, all of the patients are performing poorly most of the time. In fact, every single person was significantly impaired on at least 3 of our cognitive tests. And that's at the point that they left the ICU. But the beauty of this approach is that we can follow them for months follow them for years. And at the moment, we're well into year 2 or 3 with some of these patients, that we're looking at whether, in fact, after this severe brain injury, they go on to gradually get better or stay the same, or worst case scenario, they actually continue to deteriorate over time. But they're all starting, as you can see, from a fairly low baseline. That is, after severe brain injury, you don't bounce back within a few months and, go back to school. You have many cognitive challenges to deal with sometimes for many years ahead. Now, once this battery had been sort of put on the internet, on the web, it suddenly occurred to me that we might be able to use it to start doing some extremely large-scale studies of the general population. And this started back in 2010 when we had this idea that we would test the concept of brain training. Back then, everybody was buying these electronic brain training devices to try and make themselves smarter. So we put out an ad, and in collaboration with the BBC, we encouraged people that were interested in brain training to join our study and brain train for 6 weeks. As you can see from the paper there on the left, we published a paper in the journal Nature in 2010. We had 11,000 people that brain trained for 6 weeks, and then we tested them at the beginning and at the end and compared the two. And sadly, we saw no significant changes. Even brain training for 6 weeks really didn't make any difference. But a huge study, 11,000 people. 2012, we actually recruited 44,000 people, but members of the general public that were interested in understanding the concept of IQ and how it related to our tests. And finally, more recently, we published a study on sleep. Again, this was in collaboration with the BBC. We were interested in knowing how much sleep can people get by on? How much sleep is too little sleep? How much sleep is too much sleep? Is interrupted sleep bad? Many, many questions about sleep we addressed in this study with more than 10,000 people that volunteered to tell us about their sleeping habits and take part in our cognitive assessment procedure. So we've managed to, in a sense, do a different type of science. Instead of being in the lab with 30 or 40 participants asking a single question. We're going out into the world, involving the general public, and sometimes tens of thousands of members of the general public. And I'm going to show you now, we're actually able to start answering questions that you could never ask or never answer in a lab. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about the other end of the spectrum, beyond sort of severe brain injury, the sort of things that put you in a coma or a vegetative state, to concussion. And of course, as many of you will know, concussion is extremely common. It's by far the most common form of so-called mild brain injury, particularly among young people. And it's estimated that more than 200,000 concussions occur annually in Canada alone. And this is a big problem. Now, how do you assess whether, how bad a concussion is for your brain? And we had this idea that, well, we could use this sort of citizen science, if you like, to try and start to address this problem. So we put out an ad just a couple of years ago, asking anybody who's interested in concussion and the brain to respond to us and to report on their experiences with concussion, what they'd had, how many they'd had, and also to perform our cognitive tests. And actually, we had 4,000 individuals responded, saying that they'd had at least one concussion in their life at some point. And of course, we had we had more than 4,000 participants who'd never had a concussion. So they sort of served as our control group. And again, you're looking at the 12 cognitive tests in the horizontal axis on this graph. Again, the details aren't really important, except for this area on the left-hand side with the 2 stars. That's a test that we call double trouble, which you can actually see being carried out on the right-hand side. On 11 of the 12 tests, the group who said they'd been concussed were fine on 11 of 12 tests. But on one test, the test called double trouble, they were significantly impaired. Now, this was actually quite amazing, because we didn't know much about these people. This was not a clinical trial. We hadn't brought them into the lab, but these participants didn't know what our predictions were. We didn't know exactly what we were testing. And the fact that for some reason, those people that said they'd been concussed were significantly poorer at the double trouble task was a real signal to us that there might be something in this. Now, the double trouble task, what you have to do, you have to look at the word at the top of the screen. The word here is red, but you have to ignore the word and look at the color of the ink. And then in this case, the color of the ink is also red. And then you have to press the button at the bottom of the screen where the word represents the color of the ink from the top. So you would, in this case, you would press the right-hand button because it's the word red, R-E-D. And there are many confusing trials in which the word red is written in blue or the word blue is written in red. And this is a test that we refer to as, is what psychologists call response inhibition. You have to inhibit your immediate response. You might see the word red and immediately want to hit the word red, or see the color red and immediately want to respond to the color red, when you really have to think it through and think, okay, the word is blue, but the color of the ink is red. So I've got to respond to red. And I guess in real life, this would correspond to doing things like, resisting the urge to run an amber light in your car, or resisting the urge if you're that way inclined, resisting the urge to get involved in an argument in a bar or something. It's our ability to inhibit doing what might come most naturally, what might be the first thing we think about doing. So we then took our results and we said, well, let's go and look at a group of people who routinely bang their heads. Now, these aren't people who've reported concussions. This was the varsity football team at Western. But these people obviously do routinely bang their heads together. And when we looked at 74 varsity football players, the amazing thing was they were impaired at exactly the same task. They had no impairments on 11 of the tests, but on the one test of response inhibition, they had this impairment. Now, if it hasn't already occurred to you, what's really interesting is that our entire hypothesis was driven by the citizen science, by us going out into the world and asking the general public to sort of lend us their brains in order for us to try and work out what might be going on in concussion. And then we tested that hypothesis in laboratory controlled conditions with a group of varsity footballers who came into the lab, and the prediction was that they would be impaired despite not themselves reporting being concussed. Of course, many of them had been concussed, but that wasn't why we selected them. We looked at the whole team. Now, I'm getting on to why I've been telling you all this, and that's because this study all happened in 2020. And of course, the other thing that happened in 2020 is that the pandemic began. And as the world got taken over by an obsession with COVID-19 and the pandemic, we started to think, well, we've got these online cognitive tools. They're all up and running. We've tested tens of thousands of people. Maybe we could use it to start looking at the effects of COVID-19 on the brain. And this was back in May of 2020. And by then, people were reporting things, standard neurological symptoms like headaches, aches and pains, obviously loss of smell you'll have all heard about. In more serious cases, the incidence of strokes and seizures and delirium was increasing. But people were only starting to talk about impaired cognition. And when they did, they generally used terms like brain fog. I'm just a bit foggy brained. I'm just not the way I used to be. And of course, to a neuroscientist like me, brain fog doesn't mean anything. I have no idea what somebody means when they say they have brain fog. So we set about investigating it. We put up a website. We did some publicity. We invited people to sign up, tell us whether or not they'd had COVID, how bad their COVID experience had been. In fact, we took a long medical history from them. And then we got them to do our 12 cognitive tests. And these were the sorts of questions we wanted to answer. Does COVID-19 infection result in significant cognitive impairment? Well, you might think that's not a great question now, but actually back in early 2020, it was an excellent question because nobody had any idea or what bits of cognition were most affected. Is cognitive impairment greatest for those who require ICU versus those who are not, those in the general community who don't get hospitalized, mild cases? We really didn't know. Do they get better or worse over time? And what about things like sex and age and medical risk factors? How do these all factor in to cognitive impairments after COVID-19? Well, we had 500 really dedicated participants who told us everything about themselves and performed the tests, and actually they're continuing to perform them over time so we can follow them longitudinally. And we had the whole range. This is the World Health Organization standard scale for how bad your COVID was. And it goes from a 0, which means that you were asymptomatic and you certainly didn't end up in hospital, right down to a 6, where you're in hospital, you're in the ICU, and you're on ventilation, you're on oxygen. And we had some participants across that whole range. Most of our people were in category 2, which means they had symptoms, but they managed to stay out of hospital. Now, we asked people to self-report, to say, well, do you think your memory as good as it was before you had COVID? And I should say, on average, we tested people 3 months after COVID. So these are not people who are in the throes of the virus itself. These are people who have recovered or should have recovered 3 months after COVID. And as you can see, there was a very strong correlation between how people rated their memory and their World Health Organization designation, if you like, how bad they were. And the more severe your COVID was, the worse you thought your memory was. Same for depression and anxiety. The more severe your COVID was, the more people rated their depression and anxiety as being more severe. But what about the objective data? What about what happened when we looked at things people couldn't just self-report on, their performance on the tests themselves? And I'm going to make things easy, I've just divided the tests into several different types of cognition. STM is short-term memory, reasoning, verbal abilities, processing speed, and overall score. Look at short-term memory. There were no impairments in the COVID patients. And this was a surprise because a lot of people, as you saw 2 slides ago, a lot of people were reporting that they were having memory impairments. But actually, when tested objectively, COVID-19 doesn't leave you with any impairments in short-term memory. But everything else was impaired. People had problems. People were having difficulty solving problems with verbal tasks. They were slower to think, and they were overall significantly impaired. And this was a pattern that I recognized immediately. This was something that we saw. I told you we did a study of people's sleeping habits. That came out in 2018, and the pattern was almost identical, that people who reported sleeping only 4 hours a night also had no short-term memory impairments, but they are impaired at all of the other cognitive domains that we looked at. So one way of describing brain fog, if you like, that residual cognitive impairment after COVID-19 is that you are walking around like somebody who has only slept for 4 hours the night before. There are a few other little sort of tidbits that I'll tell you about. One is that, and this won't be at all surprising, that the physical effects of COVID affected you more the older you are. So older people had more physical effects of COVID. Again, not a surprise. But this one was surprising, that mental health went in exactly the other direction. When we measured depression and anxiety, this was more common in younger people. So the younger you are, the more likely COVID-19 is to affect your mental health, whereas the older you are, the more likely it is to give you ongoing physical health problems. Is it just a matter of hospitalization? Well, I won't go into detail, but the answer is no. Yes, people who are hospitalized with very severe COVID do have worse longer-term outcomes, but we were able to pick up significant impairments even in people that had very mild symptoms and stayed out of hospital. Are people getting better or worse over time? Well, this is something we're still pursuing. As I said, we're following these patients, and we will continue to do so for perhaps 5 or even 10 years. But just looking at the first few months after COVID recovery, you can see that everything is a flat line. That is, now you can treat that as good news or bad news. It means that people aren't getting any worse over time, but they're also not getting any better. So on average, the problems that people are experiencing with things like reasoning and their speed of thinking are not getting better over time. And the final thing I think I'll say is, and this is just to address a question I often get asked, is what proportion of participants were impaired? I mean, is this everybody, or is it? And the truth is, it's not everybody. In a normal, so-called normal distribution, there's obviously going to be some people who are going to perform cognitively poorly, and they don't have anything wrong with their brains, at least not in the traditional sense. And statistically, that usually accounts for about 6%, 5 to 6% of the general population will be down the bottom of the distribution. In our COVID sample, it was about 17%. So about 3 to 4 times as many people had what we would class as a cognitive impairment relative to the general population. And yes, so that may not seem like very many people to you, but you've got to remember the number of people that have had COVID worldwide. Even 17%, if only 17% have long-term issues of cognition, that adds up to more than 700,000 Canadians, or more than 100 million people worldwide, which of course is and will continue to be a massive burden for society. And of course, that's only the known COVID-19 cases. We're all very aware that there are many cases out there that don't get reported and that we don't even know about. So that paper was published at the end of last year, disentangling the cognitive, physical and mental sequelae of COVID-19. So I think I'm going to end there. Hopefully I've done what I said I would do. I've touched on coma. I've got into cognition and moved into COVID-19. Elizabeth very graciously mentioned my book at the beginning of the talk, Into the Grey Zone. It's available in, I think, 17 languages now. It's not a science book. It's a book about science. And it's really the story of this journey, discovering patients who are in a vegetative state, but that were aware. It's got patient stories. If you want to learn more about any of the patients I've talked about, and also the methods that we use for assessing cognition. So, it's an easy read. And it'll give you a lot more information than I was able to give in my 49 minutes. So thanks very much. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Owen. And I'm going to start with some questions right away. In fact, I think I'll go to one about COVID, since that's fresh in our minds. What do you think is the basis of the impact of COVID-19 on cognitive functions?
That's a great question. I think the jury is still partly out. The bit we do know is that any respiratory disease will have an effect on brain function. it may surprise you that most of the, quote, brain injured patients that I see have actually had a cardiac arrest. They've not had something that started with a brain injury at all. But when you have a cardiac arrest, if you don't get to the hospital quickly enough, the loss of oxygen to your brain leads to widespread brain damage. So a lot of our vegetative and comatose patients have started with a heart attack at home. I'm not saying that COVID-19 is like having a heart attack, but it's having the same effect. It's interrupting the oxygen flow to the brain. And anything that doesn't give you a normal flow of oxygen to the brain will affect brain function. So that's one mechanism. Where the jury is slightly out is on whether the virus affects the brain directly. And that is, does it get into the brain and actually destroy brain cells? And there's emerging evidence that that probably is the case as well in the case of COVID-19. So I think it's unfortunately a double whammy, both a direct and an indirect effect on the brain.
Thank you. Okay, and here's one that goes right back to the beginning. Why tennis?
Why tennis? Yes, that's a great question. The reason is that we simply wanted to find something that was universally understood. So if we sort of said to the patient, you know, we want you to imagine moving your arms around in this way or that way, they can't speak to us. We don't even know if they're conscious at the beginning. So we sort of wanted something where everybody would do the same thing when we asked them to. Now, there are different things you can do when you play tennis, but there's one thing you have to do, and that's wave your arms around. And that's the sort of the common denominator that we really wanted people to do. I mean, to be fair, it wasn't the first thing we tried. We tried many other things as well, but it turned out that simply saying, imagine playing tennis, gets everybody to do something like this in their heads. And that gives us this fantastically strong signal in the part of the brain that we can see very well.
Someone else wants to know whether the brain activates through the process of hearing that question or request that they think about playing tennis.
It does. But so there's a very important distinction here. Yes, your brain does activate. And early on, when we first published the paper, actually we got both good and bad feedback. But a lot of the bad feedback was of the sort, well, maybe this just happens automatically. When you say imagine playing tennis, maybe the brain just sort of hears this and fires off some sort of automatic response. So we actually tested that in a number of ways. And I didn't have time to tell you about it today. One of them is we anesthetized healthy people and got them to imagine playing tennis. And of course, nothing happens. Now, even though the brain can hear the instruction to imagine playing tennis, your ears aren't blocked. And actually, we see activity in the auditory cortex, the parts of your brain that hear. We don't see that tennis playing activity. The other, I think, more interesting way we went about it, which is probably one of the daftest studies I've ever conducted, we put people into the scanner and we said, okay, we are going to ask you to do something and we want you to not do it. And then we said, imagine playing tennis. And nothing happened in their brains, even though they heard exactly the same instruction. And that's because imagining playing tennis is a conscious act. A bit like when I asked you to, raise your left hand, you didn't have to do it. I was asking you to do it, but, if you decided I can't be bothered to do it, or, I don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. It's a conscious act. It's not something that automatically happens when I say raise your arm. Same thing for imagining playing tennis. It doesn't automatically happen. You have to want to do it. It's almost a willful act. And that's why it works so well, I think.
Here's a question about concussions. Has anyone measured the cognitive impairment of football players after they stop playing?
Yeah, they have. But actually, that's very difficult research to do because players don't stop when they're young. Very few players, particularly at a varsity level, will then just sort of give up football. It's a thing that people obviously enjoy and they get a lot of recreational enjoyment out of it. So it's a sort of thing that you can only study, at least in large numbers, in much older players who've gone on to retire. And actually, that nobody's ever used our tests. Actually, that's not true. We published a paper of NFL players about 10 years ago using one of our tests. We didn't use the whole battery. And and we related it to a lack of activity in one part of the frontal lobe. But in general terms, yes, people have looked at people who've stopped playing football, and even years later, cognitive impairments are still there, and they do map quite well onto the things that we've identified. And you've probably heard about this in the media, that these players often behave in a disinhibited way. They'll maybe get into more fights than they should. They'll drive too fast, maybe drink too much. These are all symptoms that we typically associate with a failure of response inhibition, a failure of your ability to know what's the best thing that I should do right now. And it typically isn't to get into that fight or to gamble too much or drink too much. And so, although obviously there's different tests, in terms of what we're trying to assess with our cognitive tests, they actually map on quite well to what's been observed in the real world, even in players who've retired.
Several people have asked about the implications for MAID now that you can communicate with some patients who are vegetative.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And the implications are that the technology is there to allow us to ask people whether they would want to continue living in this situation. And there is a story in my book about us doing this with a patient. And I'm not going to spoil it by telling you what happened, but yeah, the technology is there and it's reliable enough. The question is, at what point do you start to use this routinely clinically? And I think there are quite a few hurdles that need to be stepped through first. But they're not technical, they're ethical, really. And I mean, I'm not going to labor this point, but just briefly, we don't live in a society where anybody can knock on their doctor's door and say, hey, I'd like to die. And the doctor typically doesn't act on that. Our first response would be, well, why do you feel that way? Or we want to investigate the person's mental health, or do they have the right level of mental capacity that means that they understand the consequences of what they're saying? There will be many, many questions that would need to be asked of somebody. And the same is true of these patients. Just because they're in the situation they're in doesn't mean we shouldn't check their mental health, and shouldn't check that they haven't changed their mind in a month's time, and shouldn't check that they have mental capacity. And that will take a long time. I mean, technically, it's a lot of questions you'd have to ask, and particularly if you've only got yes and no answers. But we've published several papers in the ethics literature explaining how this could be done. And the bottom line is, it would take quite a long time and a lot of effort, but there's not technically a reason why you couldn't do it. And I think if all those hurdles were were jumped, then I think applying MAID in this situation would be perfectly appropriate.
Are there any surgical treatments or other therapies available for vegetative patients whose brains light up?
There aren't, unfortunately. And I mean, this is a terrible situation because, of course, there are many methods out there that people try to peddle. And we encounter very, very often patients' families come to us and say, I've learned about this technique. Should we try it? And I can tell you there are no proven interventions, either drugs or electrical therapies or oxygen therapy comes up quite often. There's nothing that has been proven to be efficacious in bringing a patient out of a vegetative state. That said, there are many people around the world working on this problem. And, as I've always said, the first issue in trying to solve a problem like this is to truly understand the patients. And we, over the last 20 years, we've got a few really important new clues. We know that the imaging tells us, as I showed you, who is most likely to recover. And that's important because it makes the search for a therapy more efficient. If we can focus on those patients that have a prospect of recovery, everything will go much faster. And that's just the way clinical medicine works. You waste a lot of time working with, time, but it's only wasted in the sense that you may never get a result working with patients who don't have the potential to recover. But if you can focus on only those patients that have potential, then everything speeds up and gets more efficient. So I'm confident that we'll get there, but we're not there yet.
So on that subject, are brain scans of vegetative patients now a standard of care?
No, absolutely not. And I get asked this question all the time, and they should be. Things are moving slowly in that direction. As I said to you, more than 1,500 patients have had these scans now around the world, all in a research context. Here in London, Ontario, we are seeing patients in the ICU, and although it's formally under a research umbrella, it is starting to happen as part of their clinical care. But I think before every patient that is eligible can get access to this, the various regulatory bodies that decide what is standard of care have to make that decision. Of course, there are economic considerations and there are practical considerations. And there's also scanners that we use aren't available in every hospital. And but things are moving in the right direction. So in Europe, the European Federation of Neurology has recommended that where possible, all patients in this situation should have the imaging. The same is true in the United States now, where, of course, different type of health system, different type of financial situation, but the recommendation from the task force in the US that makes these decisions is that patients should, before a decision is made, particularly about withdrawal of care, that these patients, should have an MRI scan. So we're getting there, but it's moving much more slowly than I would like it to.
Of course. One of our questioners refers to a book about the 1918 Spanish flu and suggestions that had an impact on people's cognition. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, it did. I mean, it's almost certain that it did. But unfortunately, historical records were very poor back then, medical records, and the way we measured cognition was extremely poor by today's standards. So we had no way of looking at the brains of people back in 1918. And actually, even the methods of testing memory and things like that were extremely rudimentary by today's standards. So all we can really go on are the sort of reports at the time of neurologists and other types of doctors reporting on people turning up, having these odd sort of struggles with thinking, as they mostly called it back then. We can get better clues from the first SARS epidemic, which of course involved many, many orders of magnitude fewer people than COVID-19 did. But there, of course, back, not very long ago, at least not relative to the 1918 flu epidemic, there were pretty good pretty good neurological examinations, pretty good cognitive assessments. And it's absolutely clear that many of the people that were affected in the SARS-1 epidemic had long-term neurological and cognitive challenges. So in that way, it wasn't a surprise to us that what we saw with COVID-19.
Interesting. So one of the lawyers in our audience asks, could a person make a last will and testament by using this process?
It's funny, I was invited to go to the UK in October to to talk at the Royal Society to a meeting of all of the High Court judges to exactly address this question, because of course, particularly in Britain, for some reason, these legal cases come up, many times, and the answer is yes. Technically, you could, but again, the issue is how many of the hoops are you going to make somebody go through to do this? So, I certainly some of them we need to, but you can make it difficult to the point that it can't be done. I couldn't scan somebody and ask them 1,000 questions; it would just take too long, and it would be too expensive. But if you could make it 20 or 30 questions and you could base a decision on that, or somebody, so and this is more relevant to the question, somebody could fairly easily change their advance directive. And I think that's really, really important, because when we work with these families, the biggest difficulty is that they have to make a decision on behalf of their loved one. if you're a lawyer listening to this, you'll know this. It's a terrible situation because they say, well, he said, if I ever get into that situation, let me go. I don't want to be like that. But actually, we also know that from a large study of about 300 so-called locked-in patients, that most people change their mind. Most people, when they're actually, now locked in isn't exactly the same as vegetative state, but it's a long way in that direction. You can't move. You can maybe blink an eye. That's all you can do to communicate with the outside world. Well, most of those patients do not want to die. They want to live. So for me, this is an incredible possibility that you could actually allow people to change their advance directive, because, what if you change your mind? What if you said all along, if this ever happens to me, let me go, and then you get into that situation, you've actually changed your mind. I mean, it's worse than being in the situation to start with. So I think it's an interesting idea, and like all of these things, it's bound to happen at some point. Somebody will do it, whether or not it's ethically okay. It will be done at some point.
Thank you. Do we have time for a few more, Dr. Owen?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, please do.
Okay, here's an interesting one. In internet-based science, isn't your population a subset of the general public as the volunteers are motivated to participate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I usually get it from psychologists, who've been running experiments in the lab for the last 50 years. And I say to them, so do you think that, the 30 undergraduates that you included in your study of, 2007, do you think that's a representative population? Of course it isn't. And somebody actually estimated just this year that 90% of psychological findings in the whole of history are based on the performance of university undergraduates. So I actually think we're getting closer to a normal population than most studies, the most studies have ever achieved. Yeah, there are some caveats. There are some problems in the sense that, you've got to have an internet connection. So you have to be somebody that uses the internet, and that narrows down our population. But again, I would argue that these days, most people have access to the internet, either on their phones or their tablets or their computers. So yes, agreed, there are some limitations, but actually I think it's a limitation of almost all cognitive science, irrespective of whether it's on the internet or not.
There's a question about making a living will. From your research, do you recommend that people lengthen the amount of time that they build into their living will to allow to recover from a vegetative state before life support is withdrawn?
I do. What I actually tell people is I ask them to write into their living will that they would like to have an MRI scan and be sent to London, Ontario to be seen in my lab. I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but it's sort of true in that, I guess when I started this work, I was really an advocate for living wills, for an advance directive, for people to write about what they actually wanted to happen. And then when we started to find these patients and to talk to them and get responsive to them, I realized, this is going back to the previous question, that maybe a living will isn't a good idea, because what if you change your mind? And so I've really focused on really trying to find out, what does this person want right now, irrespective of what they said beforehand? Because despite the fact that we all think we know what we would want to happen to us, the scientific evidence suggests that isn't what we would want to happen to us at the beginning. So I think there is an argument that living wills are, they have their place, obviously, and they're very useful in some legal senses, but there are some dangers there as well that we didn't even have to think about when this whole concept was originated. So so I didn't really answer the question. So yes, I guess I would say leave it a bit longer. I would leave it at least a year. I think that I think after a year, the chances of any recovery are really quite low. So obviously it doesn't help if you're actually aware and conscious. Doesn't really matter if it's a year or 10 years, but at least for predicting recovery, a year is a good amount of time to leave it.
I'll just give you two more.
Okay.
One, here's the first. Is it seen as possible that the brain's plasticity can generate any element of recovery from being in a vegetative state? I guess
Right.
we can also ask Dr. Norman Deutsch that when we see him on the 20th, but
And
we'd
I'm
love to
sure
hear your answer.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll say the answer is yes. And I think it is yes. I mean, in a way, it must be the case. In the patients that do recover, we don't give them anything to recover. We don't do anything with them to make them recover. It must be the brain recovering function. Now, whether it's because the parts of the brain that were damaged sort of come back online, or what is more likely, and I think this is what Norman Deutsch will say, is that areas of the brain that used to do other things take over the functions of the damaged areas. I mean, that we see. I mean, this has been extremely well documented in things like stroke, where patients who have a stroke and maybe cannot move their left arm after a considerable amount of rehabilitation, what happens is they might regain some movement of the left arm, but it's typically not the same area of the brain that's doing that. It's another area, perhaps the right arm area, that takes over some of the functions of what was the left arm area of the brain. So yes, brain plasticity is absolutely what we think is at the root of anybody that recovers.
Question here is, what would it cost to have an assessment completed? You can answer that, or you don't want to.
Do you mean a cognitive assessment or an
MRI? Assessment? I think an MRI.
Oh,
assessment of whether there's brain activity.
Yeah, I mean, it really isn't as much as people think it is. I mean, to be really honest, the cost of an MRI scan is typically not what it actually costs. So, I mean, when I scan a patient, I will typically pay between $500 and $1,000 per scan for the patient. But that doesn't mean that it actually costs that amount of money, because running the machine is actually pretty cheap. We don't have any film anymore. It's all done digitally. It's all done on computers. But the reason I pay that amount of money is because the hospital is recouping the cost of $6 million that it paid for the magnet to start with. So, and that's the same with many things like, many high-end technical medical solutions. You're not paying sort of an actual cost. You're paying, the cost of the scanner distributed over the many thousands of patients that get scanned. And for that reason, costs are coming down. So when I started imaging 25 years ago, we were paying upwards of $2,000 a scan. We were down to $500. If it's a healthy person, not in a hospital environment, it actually only costs about $150. So, and I'm going to guess where this question is coming from. Either way, whether you're paying, $1,000 or $200, these aren't amounts of money that are out, in terms of medical devices. In a world where a sophisticated state-of-the-art wheelchair could cost you $25,000, a couple of $1,000 an MRI scan, particularly if it can change somebody's diagnosis and their prognosis, is, I think, is small change in terms of the amount of money that is spent on medical care in the Western world.
Well, I think we should probably let you go at this point, having answered about 25 questions, which we really appreciate, because people join these events really wanting to have an opportunity to share their questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Owen. This has been so fascinating. Every speaker that comes to us does a fantastic job of making the incredibly complex comprehensible to lay people like ourselves. So we very much appreciate not only you coming and speaking to us, but the incredible work you're doing, and we will follow it with great interest. Can I please tell our audience, please, to come back next week, and we'll hear about the new science of dreams from Dr. Antonio Zadra from University of Montreal. And then, as we mentioned earlier, Dr. Norman Deutsch will be joining us in Coburg on the 20th of April. And before you leave, please take 30 seconds to respond to the survey that will pop up on your screen. But once again, Dr. Adrian Owen, it's been an absolute pleasure. I learned so much. I'm so thankful to you for taking the time to join NLC. Have a good evening. Thank you again.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. See you again. Bye now.
Bye.